Hello, I'm Richard Drexler, and you're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi everyone, John Liebman here, founder and first baseman of ForBassPlayersOnly.com, where people are learning bass despite sore muscles, achy joints, and just getting older. We have a very special guest this week, Richard Drexler. He's a bass player, of course. He's also a pianist, composer, arranger. He has performed with so many of my heroes. He's performed with the Woody Herman Orchestra, Kenny Drew Jr., George Benson, Mel Torme, Tony Bennett, Diane Carroll, Mose Allison, Nat Adderley, Gary Burton, Paquito de Rivera, Al Di Meola, Hank Jones, Mike Stern, Billy Cobham, Chick Corea, Arturo Sandoval, and so many others. Richard and I actually have a lot in common. We were both born in the Midwest. We moved to Florida in the 1980s. We both played the bass. And my son, as a matter of fact, went to the University of Central Florida, where Richard has had a long-standing presence. Hello, Richard. Honored to have you on my show.
Thank you.
I first became aware of you through Jeff Berlin, whom I've gotten to know pretty well over the years, and I know you've been on a lot of his recordings, and you've toured and traveled and performed with him. But I'd like to go back to the beginning. You are originally from Illinois, so tell me about your initial exposure to music.
Okay, I had no choice but to be surrounded by music. My parents were both university music professors at Illinois Wesleyan University, where I wound up going and being a classical piano major. Um, so I started when I was 16 there. After 3 semesters, uh, I was studying more partying and related things to that than I was music. So my dad gave me to another teacher, thinking there was maybe some weird Freudian conflict or something that I wasn't, and I didn't do much better for the other person either. But
Oh, excuse me, you started college at 16?
yes. Mhm.
So you're a prodigy.
Well, I took summer school and could get through high school in 3 years, and I was always the youngest one in my class anyway. But in high school, University High School of Normal, Illinois, which is run by Illinois State University, the other university in town there, um, I was very fortunate to have a classmate, John Campbell, who played piano. He was Mel Torme's pianist for 5 years. He played in Clark Terry's band for a while, played with Getz, Milt Jackson, all sorts of people. Um, I actually just spent some time with him. He's back in Illinois, in Central Illinois now. But in high school, anywhere there was a piano, he was playing jazz. And I got interested in it and just would hang around and talk to him. And we were playing out of the same, I had the Dave Brubeck book that had the transcriptions of his solos from like Time Out and Time Further Out. I somehow had gotten that. And we got to talking, and he saw that I was somewhat interested and seemed to be serious about the music. And he needed a bass player because the guy he had played with before had graduated. And I played violin and viola and in the orchestra. And he said, bass is just a big violin. Can't be that hard to figure out. I mean, he didn't say anything about the bloody fingers and the, like all of that. But so I really had no idea what I was doing other than he said, I want to join this or compete in this Oak Lawn High School Jazz Festival outside of Chicago, which happens annually. And so it'd be great if I could have a trio. So he actually told another guy, Clay Hewlett, who lives in Atlanta, who was a timpanist and mallet percussionist. He got him to get a drum set or figure out how to play a drum set. So basically, I'd been playing bass a month when we went to the Oak Lawn High School Jazz Festival, and I won All-Star Bass. I was a terrible bassist. I hear recordings of us back then. I can't believe I would actually play that way and show my face in public. It was awful. But what John had was he had over 100 Oscar Peterson trio records, LPs, and he just loaned me a stack of them and said, just copy what this Ray Brown guy does. And I had no idea of anything what jazz was about other than to basically we're playing some of the same tunes. And it's like, just copy what Ray Brown did on there. So it sounded like I had a concept of knowing what I was doing.
So you were not only new to the bass, but you were new to jazz, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
I went in a music store. Well, I know I'm just getting ready to do a solo piano recital, and I'll have bassist Charlie Silver from here in Orlando and drummer Clarence Penn, who's on our faculty now, join me for about half the program trio. And one tune I want to play is the Gene Ammons version of Eddie Haywood's Canadian Sunset from the Boss Tenor LP, because the first jazz record I ever bought was a 45 RPM of that cut. Because back then they had jazz 45s, and I got it for a dime at a thrift store. And then I went to a music store and I said, I don't know anything about jazz, but I think I'm getting interested in it, and I want to listen to something. So sell me a couple records that are representative of jazz. So the first record they sold me was the double album Miles Davis Live at Fillmore East, which I don't understand at all now, but at the time I understood it because it had a rock beat, and I could kind of hear that and figure it out. The other one was Stanley Turrentine Sugar on CTI, which to me is very inside, very accessible, very straight ahead, nothing weird about it. But I know when I first put it on, it just sounded like noise to me. I had no frame of reference to understand what was going on at all.
The Stanley one or the Miles?
Yeah,
one?
the Stanley one.
Wow.
Which now makes me realize when I'm playing something and I hear something, somebody else may be hearing something totally different and not having any way of organizing it and knowing they're not hearing the same thing I'm hearing. But then obviously I learned to get it. And after Ray Brown, the main influence on my bass lines was Ron Carter, especially from all those CTI records. Because once I figured that one out, I got like Red Clay by Freddie Hubbard and a bunch of other CTI records, and Ron was on virtually all of them. Now, actually, a week from tomorrow, he's coming down here and is going to play. Our student big band is going to open for him, and he's going to play, and he's going to use one of my two basses. I'm going to take them both over to him so he can choose one. And also, so hopefully I can maybe play a two bass tune with him, but at sound check or something. But
so you're listening to this Ray Brown guy, then you discovered Ron Carter, and any other bass influences that come to mind?
Well, the usual suspects. By the time I got to college, and then when I graduated from college, I moved to Chicago, and these same two guys that we'd been a trio through high school and college, John Campbell and Clay Hewlett, we roomed together in a couple different places in Chicago. And we had 7,000 jazz LPs in our apartment between the three of us, and we basically listened to them 24 hours a day. Wow. And not only that, we had a big apartment with a grand piano and a big living room, and there was a lot of jam sessions going on. There was always a scene of a lot of players, especially in the late 70s in Chicago, was really happening. And basically, John was in a quartet called the Ross Trout Quartet. Ross was a great guitar player. His dad, I believe, was a vice president of CBS or something like that. And he had this digital delay sound that he wound up going to University of Miami. And a lot of people say that that's where Pat Metheny basically got, they kind of developed that sound together. But like Ross was basically a pre-Metheny version of Metheny. And hearing the way that band sounded, was rehearsing in my apartment. And the bass player was Steve Rodby and the drummer was Paul Wertico. So Metheny wound up taking half the band also, as well as the sound. But Pat was, first Jamie Aebersold combo camp I went to was at my alma mater, Illinois Wesleyan. And I think I was still in high school, and I showed up, and because of this Oaklawn High School award and things, I thought I was pretty hot stuff. And I got there, and here's Metheny, James Williams, Donald Brown, Danny Gottlieb, Mike Hyman, Bill Evans was, I think, 12, the tenor player. All these people were my same age or, high school kids and just playing way beyond me. And I realized, oh, okay, I've got a ways to go. In fact, Metheny was telling people, there's never been a world-changing jazz guitarist since Wes Montgomery. I'm going to be that guy. And we're looking at him like, Okay, who are you? And he did it.
I saw him with both of those guys you mentioned, Paul Wertico and Steve Rodby at in Miami. What took you down to Florida?
I actually had, well, I mentioned my kind of wild life in college. I wound up on a college extension program my junior year when I went to New York and was supposed to be apprenticed to Bob James. I've since played with him. I told him this, but he was so busy he could never even meet with me. So I wound up being apprenticed to three other people, including David Horowitz, who was playing keyboard in Dave Sanborn's band with Hiram Bullock and Victor Lewis and Herb Bushler and so forth. And so I was hanging out a lot, but in my private life, I was basically by myself in New York, and my partying, I realized I was pretty much out of control. I was basically a 19-year-old alcoholic drug addict, and I had a series of cataclysmic events that wound up being a spiritual thing, basically dying and being raised from the dead, which is a whole nother story. Because of that, I basically quit playing, went into ministry for a while, went to Bible school. I'm an ordained minister. And I got to Orlando to be the music pastor of a small church. And so after a couple of years of that, they were saying, we're having a hard time paying your meager salary. You better do something else for income. And I thought, well, the only thing I know how to do is play gigs. So maybe I'll start doing that again. How can I do that? And I happened to call Ira Sullivan, just asking why I heard he always played Amazing Grace at the end of every performance. And he said, I'm promoting your album. I'd never met him. He said, you are? He said, yeah, I've been to your apartment, played with John Campbell, and I got a copy of your album, and this album had scripture on it to go with the tunes. And he said, I'm telling everybody about that you're doing this. It was an album with Dave Liebman, Tom Harrell, Steve Laspina, and this drummer, Clay Hewlett, that I mentioned, 1978. And so he said, I'm coming to Orlando. Why don't you sit in and, we'll meet. And so I sat in.
On bass?
I don't even remember if I played piano or bass. I think I wound up playing piano because at the end, the pianist, who was Jewish, did not have any idea how to play Amazing Grace. And then Ira, just as he would typically would start launching into some other hymns. And he was struggling. I think I sat in on bass, but then they called me up to play piano just to rescue this pianist that didn't know these hymns that I was playing. But the guy who was kind of leading the band that I was playing with runs a great jazz club that I play at regularly here in Winter Park, Florida, called Blue Bamboo Center for the Arts. I think a year or two ago, Downbeat had a thing about the top 200 jazz clubs in the world or something. That was one of them. So it's a great venue that he came back to town here and started. But he reminds me of that date when I sat in, because I evidently had the quintessential Florida geezer look of sandals, dark socks, khaki shorts, and a t-shirt. And I'm sitting in a big concert,
I'm glad you mentioned Ira. I used to play with him every Monday night in Miami when I was.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I was down there from '84 to '90, and I was
great player, great guy.
Yeah, he really was. And another name I saw, Buddy DeFranco. I did a tour with him. This was over Thanksgiving 1985. It was a cruise, actually. We went out of Fort Lauderdale. We went through, where did we go to? Mexico and Colombia and Jamaica. We went through the Panama Canal. It was really interesting, but playing with him was just a wonderful experience.
The John Campbell that I mentioned, I know, played with him quite a bit. But
he was a great guy.
I played it's kind of funny. I played a clarinet convention or something that Florida State University had with Buddy, and he was complaining to the guy about this and that, and the guy finally just said, Buddy, this is really not working out. This is obviously a hassle for you. I think maybe I'll just call Eddie Daniels. And it's like, buddy, totally shut up. And he was fine with everything from then on.
Yeah. Eddie came down to the school also. You mentioned University of Miami. That's what took me down to Florida. And Eddie Daniels was one of the guys that came through. But there are some other names on the list. I rattled off, I don't know, 24 names at the beginning of this conversation. But you played with Cheap Trick and Donovan. I mean, those names don't really flow with Nat Adderley and Hank Jones.
I played with them. There was I kind of, for several years here in Orlando, there was a contractor that booked a lot of the personnel for shows at a number of the performing arts centers. So what would typically happen is a headliner would come in, you do a rehearsal somewhere, play the concert that night. Then for the rest of the week, you'd crisscross the state playing one night in, Jacksonville, then the next night in Naples, then the next night in Gainesville, the next night in Miami, the next night in Orlando, next night in Melbourne. I mean,
Yeah.
performing arts centers. And so he happened to book the group. Cheap Trick did a cover of the entire Beatles Sgt. Pepper's album.
Wow.
And so I played keyboards in that, an extra keyboard, and with full symphony orchestra. And then the Indian piece, I forget the name of it, that George Harrison wrote. They actually had some Indian musicians play, and I played bass with that. And Donovan was singing that.
Within You, Without You?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Did you know Tom Peterson and his 12-string bass? Tom Peterson from Cheap Trick.
I didn't interact with him, no.
Okay. So I just had to ask you.
That was at Ruth Eckerd Hall in Clearwater. They only performed that show 4 times: New York, Las Vegas, London, and Clearwater.
Okay. You remind me of my Florida days. I knew the toll booth operators on the Florida Turnpike. I was playing. Remember the Century Villages? I don't even know if they still have those down there, those retirement homes. And we played the Ink Spots and Patty Andrews from the Andrews Sisters. And
I did that circuit too for a while, just go up and down each coast and hit these retirement centers. I remember doing that with Frank Gorshin, who was the Riddler.
Riddler, yeah.
All sorts of people like that basically their entire fan base that knew who they were all the age of the people in retirement centers and nobody else, so those
yeah. Eddie Fisher, Donald O'Connor, Eartha Kitt, all the Ink Spots. I mentioned Jeff Berlin, and I want to hear about that, but I noticed that there are a lot of bass players on the list of people that you've played with: Chuck Berghofer, Brian Bromberg, Dave Carpenter, Stanley Clark, Dave Friesen. So what is this?
Dave was on 2 of my, actually, while I was still out in the ministry thing.
Which Dave?
Out in Tulsa. Dave Friesen played on a record of mine, actually 2 records, Tulsa Concert Volume 1 and 2. He and John Stoll were touring, and I had them come.
He has a very famous sister, actress. What's her name? Diane Cannon, I think.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
They are brother and sister.
Okay. Well, I knew him from Abersold camps when he was in Joe Henderson's quartet.
Oh,
I think. Or no, I'm sorry, he wasn't. Wait, was he?
I saw Joe.
Anyway, Abersold camp something or other, and we actually had some talks when I was a student and he was a faculty that were very important in my spiritual development that I kind of alluded to. And this record was actually vocal tunes that I wrote, and I played piano, and they were scripturally based, and he played on them. So I know he seems to still be doing well. During COVID, I saw some of the things he was doing online and stuff, but I haven't really had that much conversation with him over the years. But no, I've worked about equally as far as gig wise on piano and bass primarily.
Yeah,
some violin or viola, but usually piano or bass. I've actually played celeste, timpani, a few other things, organ, like with symphonies and stuff. there's actually 11 symphony orchestras in Florida that I've subbed with on 7 different instruments.
Wow.
But
How about electric?
I mean, I will. My theory is, I would rather do something I can't do and learn how to do it than sit at home and not work. So, if a Greek wedding band called me because they were desperate and they couldn't get somebody, I'd show up and I'd say, "Where's the music?" Say, "Oh, there's no music. You just have to like hear this stuff that's all changing meter every bar and play." So it's okay. All right, here we go.
What about electric bass? Have you played much or any?
I didn't start playing until after playing acoustic. So I had to kind of, most people, they play lightly because they start on electric bass and then they have to learn how to play an acoustic. I played the electric too hard to get good tone out of it. I had to learn to lighten up, but I haven't really played it much. The only one I have, I bought for $150, and it's a 1970 Fender Precision that I bought from Kelly Sill, who's the bassist on my trio record. Kelly in Chicago. I've never had another one, and I don't play it that often. I used to play every year. Mannheim Steamroller would come to Universal Studios and play for the whole month of December, and I would play electric bass. Actually, I started in keyboard and that, and then they moved me to electric bass when somebody couldn't do it anymore or something. But very few. There was one Jeff Berlin gig where they misread the writer and didn't get me an acoustic bass. They got me an electric bass. And so suddenly we're playing stuff that's trio, 2 electric basses and drums, which you can't hear the timbral difference, which is the whole point of the acoustic bass and electric bass. Plus, I'm having to compete with Jeff Berlin on an instrument I hardly ever play.
But Brian Bromberg was one of the names that I mentioned. He and Steve Bailey, when they both learned on upright, and when they played the electric, they kept the same fingering. So when they got up to around the 12th fret, they'd go into thumb position on the electric. Brian says, "I don't have time to learn a new technique. This is what I know, so I'm going to do that." So talk to me.
The Aneurysms record of Jeff Berlin that I think was first issued in Japan under Ace of Bass, and then here it was called Aneurysms. That was actually recorded at Brian Bromberg's studio. So he played the parts that I normally would play on acoustic bass. And so I just played piano on that record. In fact, I remember I had 104 temperature.
Oh.
And I mean, we'd rehearse that stuff, and that stuff was very difficult because that was basically Jeff's tribute to Frank Zappa and Vinnie Colaiuta, who was on the record. The two of them played in Zappa's band together. So those tunes were very difficult. That's not the type of thing you just call a pianist and they come in sight read. And so, I mean, I had to make the date or it wouldn't happen. So I remember going the night before to the emergency room, and I sat there for 6 hours, and I never got seen by a doctor. And I just said, well, I must be all right. I'm still alive. It's time to go to the airport. So I just went to the airport and flew to LA and played the album. And I don't even remember it now. I mean, I listened to it and I think, wow, okay, that sounded all right on that. I don't even remember it. Like when I wasn't playing, I was lying down feeling awful.
Oh.
And so
I survived. I don't know if you know this story. I went to visit his school, or what used to be a school in Clearwater, I think.
Players School of Music, yeah.
Right, and what's her name? Vicky, his ex-wife, showed me there were two manuscripts framed hanging on the wall.
Pedro's Dowry.
Was that the Zappa?
Yeah, because that was the audition. Jeff showed up to meet Frank, and he said, "Okay, take this music, bring it back tomorrow, and play it for me."
Yep.
So he came back, and he said, some of these things I had to take down, they're off the range of the instrument. He said, "No, it shouldn't be." And he looked at it and said, "Oh, I gave you the guitar part."
That's the story.
Here's the bass part. And Jeff sight read it and he said, "Okay, you got the gig," because it's all like brackets, like 17s and and huge interval jumps and everything. And Jeff, nailed that.
I saw Zappa in like 1978 or something. He was one of a kind.
Yeah, so he has the guitar part and the bass part to that framed, the ones that Zappa did. Yeah.
So how did you hook up with Jeff? Like I mentioned, you guys did a lot of stuff together.
Well, I had a house gig. I had 2 house gigs basically for 9 years. One of them was at the Hurricane for 6 years. This was a club in St. Pete Beach. They'd had jazz there for 40 years. we played there 5 nights a week for 6 years. Then they fired us, kept the bass player, Mark Neuenschwander, and had 3 other guys. And I think what happened was one night the owners, who I'd hardly ever seen the whole time I was there, decided to come in, like, check out what they had there. And there were 4 subs on the gig. And so they just pulled the plug on it. So who are these guys? But yeah, that was a great gig. Dave Hardman on drums, who is retired from teaching, is now back in St. Pete. Sax player most of the time was David Moss. We had many other people. We actually counted up 88 people that were hired for that gig, like, because we'd sub out all the time and find people of subs. And various people would come through and sit in. One night the whole Harry Connick big band all came and sat in. I mean, our last night of the gig, Nat Adderley just showed up and played the whole night. Yeah, that was a great gig. I was trying to think what I was tying that to, or what I was going to say. What did
Jeff Berlin?
Oh, Jeff subbed there. Jeff was a sub. Like, that was the first time I met him. Was actually, he came down there to sub and play the gig, and I was playing piano. And so then the first album that I did with him was In Harmony's Way, which was, I think, 2000 or 2001. And that was kind of his, it was an all-star thing with Gary Burton, Mike Stern. Claire Fisher played on one tune, was there. I actually wound up getting Dave Liebman to overdub things on it, because I had a tune that I wrote called Liebman on a Jet Plane.
Yes,
you should play
it.
Yeah. And Jeff wanted to buy the title from me. I said, no, I'm writing that tune. And so he wanted to do it. So said, well, we got to have Liebman on the record, like, just to play on his tune. So the Chick Corea was supposed to do that. And so I guess he bailed on it for some reason. And so Jeff suddenly had to get a piano. So he had played with me at the Hurricane. He called me, and basically, I guess based on my doing that, I became his regular pianist, traveling with him for 12 years. And the only reason I quit was teaching part-time at University of Central Florida. I had thought about doing a master's degree, and things seemed kind of slow, and maybe this would be the time to do it. And I knew as soon as I committed to doing it, like signing the papers to doing a teaching assistantship and committing to doing my master's degree, that the phone would start ringing, and it did. Of course, Jeff called, wanted to do a big tour and an album with Dennis Chambers, and Scott Henderson wound up doing that. But I said, Jeff, I'm sorry, man. I got to be here all the time. I can't leave for possibly a week. I could get away, but so that kind of stopped my traveling with him. We still are in contact about doing some recording and maybe touring in the summer or doing something, but
he must have
it was good. It was good that I got my master's, because otherwise I wouldn't have my full-time teaching gig, because the part-time turned into full-time. And when I started at UCF, I taught piano for 2 years, and then they made that full-time, and I didn't have my master's, so they moved me to bass. But then when they made the bass full-time, if I hadn't have gotten my master's, I would not have been eligible to even apply for the gig. So
he must have not known immediately that you were a bass player too, if he saw you play piano, unless he knew about you beforehand.
I don't know how that came about. Right from the start, when I started touring with him, that was going to be part of our difference between us and other trio, was that I generally play about 3/4 of the tunes on piano, maybe 1/4, several tunes a night on the 2-bass format. Okay. And I think it works really well. He had a tune on Lumpy Jazz called Have You Met Miss Spuche that
yes.
he wrote on, it's a contrafact of Have You Met Miss Jones. And I think that came off really well. I know there were some, we talked about one gig. It was actually at Alexanderplatz in Rome, very famous jazz club. And we played there several times, but this one time they rented us a bass that was horrible. And I never traveled with a bass. it was totally potluck what kind of bass or piano I was going to get. And so one night we'd be in an opera house with a 9-foot Bösendorfer and a 350-year-old bass that just sang and growled and everything. And the next night there'd be a bass that the strings were 2 inches high and you try to play a note and it went, thud, and that was the case here in Rome. His tune, This Is Your Brain on Jazz. He has a line, and the acoustic bass just plays a B flat and sustains it, and then plays some other pedal points. So I went to hit this note, and it just goes dun, and it's sustained for like about a second, And
That's what the bow was.
and I looked at each other and just wordlessly said, "Okay, that's the last acoustic bass tune of this gig." I played a piano once with 5 keys missing, 5 black keys missing. There were just holes. So I mean, it was definitely an experience. And like I say, the one time there was actually an electric bass instead of an acoustic bass.
Jeez, I traveled a lot. My brother and I played a lot, and if he had a really bad piano, he would take a pencil and just put a mark on don't use these keys because they don't work. Or there's. I just want to mention, because you were talking about Dave Liebman. In case anybody is wondering, I get asked all the time, "Are you guys related?" I've met him a bunch of times. I said, "My name's Liebman too," and he said, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" And we tried to trace it back, and we couldn't find any commonality. But I said, "Can I still come over for dinner on Friday night, or can I tell people we're related?" Of course. I don't know. That's the answer. What's keeping you busy these days? I think you kind of hinted at a couple of things.
Well, I still gig. I rarely go out of town now. I used to, basically for decades, I drove 40 to 60,000 miles a year, because Florida, as is basically one market. You get called the network is like everybody in the state, and they call you to come to this town, that town, and then doing these shows, like I mentioned, that put a lot of miles on when you'd play with the same person in a different city every night. But yeah, 40 to 60,000 miles a year driving used to be. Now I'm full-time. I'm in my 7th year of teaching full-time at UCF, plus my 9th year of teaching part-time at Valencia College, a 2-year school that's kind of feeds UCF. UCF has 72,000 students. Valencia College 2-year school has 70,000 students.
Oh, I had no idea that UCF was so big, or Valencia for that
matter. If it hasn't overtaken Arizona State, UCF was always the 2nd largest university in the country. Wow. Enrollment.
I did not.
I have a private studio, and then I still play gigs here around Orlando. So I, play a couple, 3 gigs a week and teach a lot. So I'm pretty busy. Yeah.
I want to ask you about playing bass and learning bass. You've been playing a long time, and you've been an educator for a long time. People are coming to ForBassPlayersOnly.com from all over the country, all over the world, to learn bass. Most of the people that I am attracting tend to be men in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They're not really career bound. They're not trying to set the world on fire. They're not trying to be rock stars. They want to play some classic rock riffs with their buddies, some blues shuffles, maybe some walking bass, a little funk R&B. So in that context, what advice do you have for somebody who wants to learn bass? What do you think they should know?
Well, like you say, you don't have to be a star to do it. I mean, you can do it at whatever level you do it for your enjoyment, do it to play a few gigs. I do tell people, basically anywhere there's gigs going on, usually the thing that's in shorter supply is basses. If you learn to play bass, you can move anywhere and probably like fit into the scene and get some gigs pretty soon. I was talking about the situation where all the, these musicians in the late 80s, when I started playing in Orlando, there was so much work of conventions and things that required big bands and so forth. These contractors, there were a bunch of contractors that were hooked into all the, there's actually in Orlando, there's over 100 theme parks. It's not just Universal and Disney.
Wow.
There's incredible amount of stuff. And there's especially back then, there was stuff going on where people that were known as contractors were just inundated with requests. They kind of had to prioritize what they could put the band together. But there were so many players that they had plenty to choose from, except for bassists. So basically all the contractors in town learned to play bass, because that's one more contract they could sign. And they used to have to pay bass players more than anybody else just to like bid for their services. And so they basically learned to at least play electric bass functionally to like get through tunes where they could cover a gig, and that way they could hire a whole another band, get the booker's fee, and then plus not even have to pay the bass player. That's like even more money they made. So but you know how they learned, I don't know. I mean, I told you how I learned was just copying Ray Brown on recordings, and I still think the most important thing is not practicing the instrument, but as much as you practice the instrument, so much more than that, you ought to listen to recordings and learn through the ear. Absolutely. Even when I was a classical piano major, my dad, who was my teacher, would say, you know, use your ear. And so if I was going to play a Beethoven sonata, before I would ever try to play it, I would get recordings of it, pick the recording I liked the best, listen to it over and over again. And I found that if I had it in my ear, my fingers could play it. I didn't have to do a lot of mechanical busy work practice. If, you know, even classical music you can learn by ear, but especially jazz, because there's so many rhythmic nuances that you can not possibly get from a book. You know, you can write out the rhythms, but it's not exactly what it says. It's not, you know, the actual execution of it has got to be the way it sounds. You know, it's not anything you can tell somebody other than playing it and let them hear it.
Absolutely. No substitute for that, for sure. What would you be if you weren't a bass player or a player of any of the other instruments you play? Something outside of music.
Well, I've never wanted to be limited to just music. I have a lot of interests. I currently have 7 books that I'm writing. I don't know if I'll ever be focused enough and unbusy enough to finish any of them. But if I do, it would be the most of anybody that has 7 books. It would have to be the widest range of topics of any. So I've got a jazz harmony and improvisation book out that I co-wrote with a former student of mine, Dr. Herb Silverstein. But I'm writing a book. I'm doing a paraphrase of the New Testament. I'm doing a book on pet crayfish ownership. I'm doing a book on the history of franchise model of restaurants and like chains in general, basically based on the history of Steak and Shake, which was founded by friends of the family. I'm doing a book on convergences, many things happening, because I've been in many instances of my life of a whole series of events that each are like millions to 1 odds of happening and the timing of them and stuff. I mean, I've literally had dozens of instances like that, and just kind of the whole idea of possibilities, odds, divine intervention, explaining why things can happen that can only happen 1 in a zillion times, and they do over and over again. Chance meetings, you know, and so forth. I'm doing a book on model railroad yard design. I don't even remember what the other topics are, but anyway, my interests are varied.
Yes, they are. Well,
the crustacean thing, of course, I'm known for a lot. I decided to be obsessed with lobsters or crayfish in high school by reading after Salvador Dali, the painter who valued obsession objects. And that culminated in my taking a live lobster to prom as my date in high school, which is like the legendary story I'm most famous for, probably.
Yeah, I could see how people would talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, Richard, I could go on talking like this for nonstop, but I think we've got some great information here, and I know that our audience is going to find it captivating and compelling. So I really appreciate it, and what a great story! So many interesting things. I hope talking about those books, by the way, inspires you to just finish one, and then finish another one, and then finish another one.
Well, the one that would be of most interest probably is a book of memoirs of all these hundreds of experiences. But the dilemma is, and actually Todd Kuhlman just contacted me because he's kind of doing something similar, but and I told him, well, I've got this book going. I've got hundreds of these funny stories like you're asking for. But my problem is, like, do I wait till these people die, or do I change their names, or I just say an anonymous person, because some of them are, they, you have to be careful what you say about people when they're alive, for, just what it could, mean to other people reading it. So I definitely have that going though, and sometime whenever this comes out, I mean, I began to realize, my life is not a normal life. All these stories of things that have happened. The one that actually got me realizing I need to write all this down was my very first gig with Jeff Berlin on tour. Danny Gottlieb and I met in Atlanta to fly to Milan. I'd flown from Tampa and he'd flown from Orlando, and we were sitting next to each other. And this was before cell phone, or Jeff had a cell phone, and said, have you talked with Jeff? Do you know anything about this? No. Yeah, I've been too busy to really ask anything. It's like, basically we discovered we're flying to Italy. We have a return ticket 2 weeks later. If Jeff Berlin doesn't meet us at the airport, we have no contact or name of anyone in Europe. We would just be at the airport. We have no idea what cities we're playing. We don't know how much money we're making. We don't know the venues we're playing. We have no hotel information. Nothing. We're just on a plane going to Milan, and we're going to land and hope that Jeff is there. Otherwise, we're basically just like walking around for 2 weeks and then leaving. So fortunately, Jeff was there. And our first gig, we drive to this little town, and to make a long story short, the mayor is the head of the local jazz association. He's having his first jazz festival, and he owns a facility that has some rooms, and rather than rent a hotel, we're going to stay there. And we get there and we discover it's a mental institution. And there are these Thorazine zombies walking around staring at us and drooling. And that's the way our initial tour with Jeff started off. And I said, I really have to write all this down.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, I'm glad I asked. That is a great story. I'm sure you have a lot more too. So let's keep in touch. Let's follow up, and let's do another interview. I hope to meet you in person one day soon. I like to get down to Florida as often as I can. But wow, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Much luck, continued success to you with any and all of those projects, and probably a whole bunch you didn't even mention. So thank you very much, our special guest, Richard Drexler. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman of ForBassPlayersOnly.com, where people are learning bass despite sore muscles, achy joints, and just getting older. We will see you all next week for ForBassPlayersOnly.com. In the meantime, let's play bass.